Have you ever stopped to think about how much time we waste worrying about tomorrow? It's like trying to carry a backpack full of rocks that shouldn't even be there. But do you know what is most incredible? God has already taken care of everything. Yes, everything. The Bible shows us that He is in control of the future and that we can rest in that truth. Do you want to know how to trust more and live in peace without the anxiety that holds you back? So stay with me, because in today's video, I'm going to show you why you can let go of that weight and trust that God is already in charge. You will see how it can change your life. Let's go. Have you ever stopped to watch the birds in the sky? They fly calmly, without carrying heavy backpacks or worrying about the next day. Imagine a tiny bird flying from branch to branch, not knowing where it will find its next food. Sounds worrying, doesn't it? But in fact, they know they will find it. Do you know why? Because God takes care of them. There in Matthew 6:26, Jesus reminds us of this. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and your heavenly Father feeds them. Aren't you much more valuable than them? Now stop for a minute and think. If God even takes care of the birds, why do you think He isn't taking care of you? Sometimes we feel like that little bird trapped in a cage, the cage of worries. We keep flapping our wings desperately, trying to find a way out of problems that, in fact, God already has a solution for. The problem is that the noise of our worries prevents us from hearing God's voice. Our mind is so full of fears, bills to pay, problems at work, health or family, that we forget God is taking care of us all the time, even when we don't realize it. Imagine a child playing on the playground. She runs back and forth, completely distracted by her toys. But in the distance, his father is there, watching his every move, ready to act if something goes wrong. This is how God is with you. Even when you don't realize it, He is taking care of everything. Now imagine a beautiful, well-kept garden. Each flower gets exactly what it needs. Some need more sun, others more shade. The gardener knows exactly what each plant needs to grow and flourish. Likewise, God knows what each of us needs. Sometimes it seems like something is missing, but in reality, God is taking care of the invisible details, preparing what you really need at the right time. Isn't it incredible to think that the Creator of the universe, who holds the stars in the sky, is attentive to every detail of your life? He doesn't just take care of the big things, but also the small ones. Sometimes He gives us what we need without us even asking. And you know what's more beautiful? God takes care of everything, not just our physical body, but also our heart and soul. He takes care of emotional wounds, worries that no one sees, and even doubts that we dare not confess. He supports us when we are tired, lifts us up when we fall, and guides us when we feel lost. So the next time you look at the sky and see a little bird, remember, it flies peacefully because it trusts in the Creator's care. And you? Are you ready to let go of the weight of your worries and trust that God is taking care of you in every detail? Imagine walking side by side with someone you love very much, knowing that you have to make the most difficult decision of your life. This is exactly what Abraham experienced when God asked him to offer Isaac, the son of promise, as a sacrifice. Every step towards Mount Moriah must have weighed tons on his heart. That boy, who had been so awaited and represented the future of Abraham's descendants, was there without understanding, carrying the wood for the altar. Can you imagine the agonizing silence between them? Abraham had everything to question, give up, or even disobey. But he continued steadfastly, trusting that God would provide a way out, even if he couldn't see it. When they reached the top of the mountain, Abraham prepared the altar and bound Isaac. And in the most dramatic moment, when Abraham raised the knife for sacrifice, God called to him, "Abraham, don't do that." Abraham looked around and saw a ram caught by its horns in the bush. God had provided the sacrifice at the exact time it was needed. This is how God acts in our lives. Sometimes He takes us to the limit, to the point where there seems to be no solution, but at the right time, and not A second before or after, provision appears, not because God takes time, but because he works in perfect time. Do you know what this story teaches us? That God always has a plan, even when we can't see it. Abraham did not know what would happen on the mountain, but he trusted God with impressive faith. Many times in our lives, we face situations that seem like a dead end, a financial problem, an unexpected illness, a dream that seems about to fall apart. What God asks of us, just as he asked of Abraham, is trust. Trust that even at the last second, he will provide what we need. We don't need to know how or where the solution will come from. We just need to believe that the God who provided the ram for Abraham will also provide for us. So, the next time you feel on edge, without seeing any way out, remember Abraham and the ram in the bush. God is not taken by surprise. He already has the provision prepared, ready to appear at the right time. And sometimes, he takes us to this point of total surrender just to show us that the solution does not depend on us, but on his faithfulness. This teaches us to rest, even in the midst of chaos, because the God who sustained Abraham is the same one who takes care of you. He never fails. Have you ever found yourself thinking about everything that could go wrong tomorrow? The mind starts to create catastrophic scenarios. What if the money doesn't make it? What if I lose my job? What if something bad happens to my family? Anxiety is like a silent thief that steals our peace and traps us in problems that don't even exist yet. It's like carrying a heavy backpack full of stones. Every worry is a stone we put there. At first, the weight seems small, but over time it becomes unbearable. And the worst, many of these worries never come true. Jesus knew that anxiety about tomorrow consumes us and weakens us. Therefore, in Matthew 6:34, he gives us a clear instruction. Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. This phrase seems simple, but it brings profound wisdom. Jesus is teaching us to live one day at a time, not to allow fear of the future to rob us of the joy of the present. After all, no matter how much we worry, we cannot change absolutely anything with our concerns alone. Worrying is like sitting in a rocking chair. You move a lot, but you don't move. Think about the story of the Israelites in the desert. When God sent manna, he commanded them to take just enough for that day. If they tried to save it for the next day, the manna would rot. This teaches us something very important. God wants us to trust him every day, step by step. He gives us what we need for today, and tomorrow he will take care of it again. It is an exercise in faith because we want to control everything, have guarantees and plans for the future. But God invites us to let go of this control and rest in the certainty that he is taking care of everything. Anxiety does not solve problems. It only takes away our peace and weakens our faith. Therefore, leave your worries in God's hands. Instead of imagining the worst, imagine what God can do. When worries come, pray. When fear knocks at the door, remember that God is already in your tomorrow. He sees what you cannot see and is preparing the way. Trust. Each day has its own challenges, but it also brings its blessings. God is in control, and that's all you need to know. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to wake up in the morning and see food falling from the sky? This is exactly what happened to the people of Israel as they walked through the desert. They had come out of Egypt, out of slavery, but they were in an arid place where there was no food or water. How would they survive? The answer came from God himself. Every morning when they left their tents, they found manna, a special bread that God sent from heaven. It was like small white seeds that covered the ground. God ordered them to collect just enough for the day, no more, no less. At first, many were suspicious. What if there's no manna tomorrow? Let's save some just in case. But something impressive happened. Whoever tried to save the manna for the next day discovered that it rotted. The food spoiled, leaving a horrible smell. Why? Because God wanted to teach a very important lesson: daily confidence. He wanted the people to understand that they did not need to worry about tomorrow, as he would take care of each day. There was no point trying to control the future or accumulating what wasn't necessary. God would provide everything at the right time. You know, sometimes we are like the Israelites. We want to accumulate security, control tomorrow, and we end up forgetting to trust God today. Maybe you're worried about your bills, your family's future, or a problem that seems unsolvable. The truth is that God does not give us the strength or resources for life all at once. He gives us enough for each day. Just like manna in the desert, God wants you to trust Him every day, one step at a time. With each dawn, He renews what you need to continue. So, when worries start to weigh on you, remember the manna. God did not leave the people of Israel to starve in the desert, and He will not leave you destitute either. Provision may not come the way you expect, but it always does. It could be a word of encouragement, a door that opens, or a solution that comes out of nowhere. God is faithful, and the same God who sustained the people in the desert is the one who sustains you today. Just trust that He will always provide enough for now. Imagine a crowd of more than 5,000 people gathered in a deserted place, all hungry after a long day listening to Jesus' teachings. The disciples, worried, said, "Master, send the people away so they can buy food in the villages." But Jesus responded with something surprising. "You give them something to eat." The disciples looked around and saw only a boy with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. How? To feed so many people with so little? Humanly, it was impossible, but in God's hands, little becomes much. Jesus took the loaves and fish, raised His eyes to heaven, and gave thanks. He simply expressed gratitude for what seemed to be insufficient. Then, something extraordinary happened. He began to distribute the bread and fish, and the more He distributed, the more there was. Everyone ate until they were satisfied, and still had leftovers. 12 full baskets. That's right, leftovers. That small snack that seemed so small turned into food for thousands of people. This miracle was not only a demonstration of Jesus' power, but also a lesson in trust and gratitude. How many times do we look at what we have and think it's too little? Little money, little energy, few opportunities. And like the disciples, we ask ourselves, how can this be enough? The truth is, when we give what we have into God's hands, He transforms it. He multiplies little and does extraordinary things. Jesus could have solved everything Himself, but He chose to use what the boy had to teach, a powerful lesson. No matter the size of your offering, God can do a lot with the little you give. This story also shows us that God's provision is abundant. Not only was there food left, but there was still 12 full baskets. This means that God not only meets our needs, but goes beyond. So, the next time you feel like you don't have enough, stop and think, what can you give to God? It could be a talent, a small resource, or even your time. When we give the little we have with faith, God makes the miracle of multiplication happen. The little in His hands becomes more than enough. Have you ever felt betrayed or wronged? Imagine Jose, a young man full of dreams, loved by his father but hated by his own brothers. They threw him into a well and sold him into slavery in Egypt. Joseph could have given in to despair, but even far from home, in a strange land and with no one by his side, he chose to remain faithful to God. As a slave in Potiphar's house, he worked with excellence and integrity. Jose did not let circumstances define who he was. He knew that, despite everything, God was with him and still had a plan for his life. But Jose's story doesn't stop there. Just when everything seemed to be getting better, he was unjustly accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown into prison. Again, he could have given up, thought God had abandoned him. But even there, in a dark and lonely cell, Jose remained faithful. He helped other prisoners, interpreting dreams and trusting that at some point God would act. Jose knew that the difficulties he faced were not the end of his story, but just part of the process. Joseph's faithfulness in the midst of adversity kept him connected to God's purpose. How many times in our lives have we felt like Joseph? We are misunderstood, wronged, or even betrayed by people close to us. At these times, the temptation is to rebel or give up. But the story of Joseph teaches us that God uses even the most difficult situations to prepare us. Joseph did not know that his time as a slave and prisoner was shaping the character and wisdom he would need later. After years of struggle, God raised him up as governor of Egypt, putting him in a position to save thousands of lives, including those of his own family. The most impressive thing is that Jose, looking at everything he experienced, declared, "You intended evil against me, but God intended it for good." Genesis 50:20. What appeared to be a series of defeats was actually the path to divine purpose. This shows us that even when things don't make sense, God is working behind the scenes. Suffering can be fertile ground for the greatest miracles if we choose to trust and remain faithful. If Joseph was able to trust God in the midst of his adversities, so can you. Have you ever planted a seed and been anxious for it to grow soon? In our haste, we look at the earth every day, hoping to see a sprout appear, but the truth is that seeds need time. There is an invisible process happening beneath the surface. Roots are growing, and the plant is getting stronger before it emerges. This is God's time in our lives. We want immediate results, quick answers, but God works at a perfect pace, very different from ours. He knows exactly when each promise must be fulfilled. Remember Abraham. God promised him that he would be the father of a great nation, but the years passed and nothing happened. Abraham and Sarah grew old, and in human eyes, time had run out. The promise seemed impossible, yet in Genesis 18, God said something amazing. Is there anything too difficult for the Lord? Abraham needed to learn that God's timing never fails. When Isaac was finally born, it was neither too early nor too late. It was at the exact moment God had planned. Sometimes we feel that God is taking too long to act. We pray, we look for answers, and it seems like nothing changes. This generates anxiety, frustration, and often even a doubt. But we need to understand that God is not limited by our clock. He sees the whole picture, while we only see a small part of the story. Waiting time is not wasted time. It is a time of growth, learning, and strengthening our faith. God uses delay to shape us and prepare us for what He has in store. Think of the farmer who knows the exact time to harvest his fruits. If he tries to harvest too soon, the fruits will not be ready. But when you wait patiently, the reward comes at the right time. Likewise, God is taking care of every detail of your life. It may seem like nothing is happening, but He is working behind the scenes. When God's time comes, you will see that the wait was worth it. Trust. Just as Abraham received the son of promise, you will also see God's promises fulfilled in His perfect time. How many times have you felt at the limit of your strength? It seems like everything falls apart. You try and try, but nothing changes. It's as if you're carrying a weight that's much greater than you can handle. The Apostle Paul knew this feeling well. He had a thorn in his flesh, something that constantly afflicted him. Paul asked God 3 times to be free from that suffering, but the Lord's answer was clear. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. 2 Corinthians 12:9. What seemed like a burden to Paul was actually the place where God showed His strength. This phrase, my grace is sufficient for you, has such profound weight. God did not say that Paul would be stronger or that the problem would be removed. Instead, He promised that His grace would be sufficient to sustain Paul. It's like a tree during a storm. The branches may sway, the leaves may fall, but the roots remain firm. When we reach the end of our strength, it is precisely then that we discover how much we are sustained by God's grace. She carries us when we can no longer walk alone. The world teaches us to be self-reliant, to never show weakness. But God shows us that there is power in recognizing our dependence on Him. When we feel weak, tired, or incapable, it is at that moment that God's power reveals itself. Think of a climber climbing a mountain. There comes a point where your hands and feet no longer have the strength. That's where he needs to fully trust the rope that holds him. This is how we are with God. When our strength fails, His grace holds us back and carries us forward. So don't be afraid of your weaknesses. Don't be embarrassed. When you feel like you've reached your limit, weakness is not the end. It is the beginning of something extraordinary. It is in your dependence on God that He manifests His power in your life. When Paul understood this, he declared, "Therefore I will gladly boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell within me," 2 Corinthians 12:9. In other words, he began to see weakness as an opportunity for God to act. When you are weak, God is strong. Imagine being called up for war, knowing that your army is small, and in the middle of preparation, the commander starts sending the soldiers back home. That's exactly what happened to Gideon. The people of Israel were about to fight the Midianites, an army as numerous as the sand on the seashore. But God told Gideon that his army was too large. It seems strange, doesn't it? In Judges 7:2, God explained, "The people that are with you are too many for me to deliver the Midianites into their hands." Israel might boast against me, saying, "My hand hath delivered me." Gideon started with 32,000 men. God told him to announce that anyone who was afraid could leave. 22,000 men left the battlefield. Only 10,000 remained. But God didn't stop there. He reduced the army again, this time to just 300 men. Humanly speaking, this was crazy. How could 300 men defeat such a large army? But God wanted to show that victory would not come from human strength, but from His power. Sometimes God puts us in situations where everything seems out of our control, just to teach us to trust Him completely. That night, God gave Gideon a specific strategy: divide the 300 men into groups and arm them with trumpets, torches, and empty pitchers. No swords, no conventional weapons, just faith and obedience. When the men shouted and broke the water jars, the Midianites panicked, became confused, and began to fight among themselves. The enemy army was defeated, and Israel won without even having to fight directly. This story shows us that God doesn't need much to do great things. He just needs us to trust Him. How many times do we look at our limitations and think we won't be able to do it? We think we need more resources, more strength, more people by our side. But God reminds us through the story of Gideon that victory does not depend on us. She depends on Him. When everything seems too small, too impossible, it is the perfect time for God to act. He reduces our armies so that in the end we know that it was He who won for us. If today you are feeling insufficient, without resources or strength, remember, God uses the unlikely to show His power. Imagine what it would be like to flee to a desert alone without food or water, and still see God taking care of every detail. This is exactly what happened to the prophet Elijah. After defying King Ahab and announcing a drought on the land, Elijah had to flee to the desert, where God sustained him in a completely unexpected way. God sent him to a place called Rivero de Quirit and said he would drink water from there. But what about the food? How would he survive? The answer was surprising. God ordered ravens to bring bread and meat to Elijah twice a day. Crows, which are birds known for not sharing food, even with their own young, were instruments used by God to feed the prophet. Imagine the scene. Elijah, alone in the middle of the desert, receiving bread and meat brought in the beaks of ravens. To human eyes, it seemed impossible, but God was showing that He is not limited by circumstances or human logic. Even in the desert, in the most arid and unlikely place, God can provide everything we need. The provision came in the right measure every day, teaching Elijah to trust completely in the Lord's care. However, the story doesn't stop there. Over time, the stream began to dry up because of the drought that he himself had announced. Imagine Elijah's feeling when he saw the only source of water slowly disappearing. He could have panicked, but God already had a next plan. Sometimes God allows a spring to dry up in our lives because He is leading us to something greater. When the brook dried up, God ordered Elijah to go to Zarephath, where a poor widow would support him. This teaches us that even when something seems to end, God has already prepared a new provision for the next step. This story challenges us to trust in God, even in times of drought and desert. When everything seems lost, He surprises us with His faithfulness. Provision may not come the way we expect, but it will come. God used ravens, unlikely birds, to show that His care has no limits. Just as He took care of Elijah, He also takes care of us. Even when the fountain seems to dry up, we can be sure that God is already preparing the next stage of our journey. He doesn't fail, even in the middle of the desert. Imagine losing everything you have, your husband, your financial security, and your hope for a better future. That's exactly what happened to Ruth, a Moabite woman who saw her life fall apart after her husband's death. His mother-in-law Naomi had also lost her husband and children and decided to return to Bethlehem, her homeland. Naomi asked Ruth to stay in Moab and continue her life. But Ruth did something surprising. She chose to stand by Naomi, saying, "Your people are my people, your God is my God." Ruth 1:16. This decision completely changed her destiny. Arriving in Bethlehem, Ruth and Naomi had nothing. They were in a situation of extreme poverty, and the only solution was for Ruth to go to the fields to gather grain left behind by the harvesters. At that time, this was a permitted practice for the poor. Ruth, with humility and determination, worked tirelessly to support herself and her mother-in-law. She could have complained or given up, but she chose loyalty and perseverance. What she didn't know was that God was using every detail of that effort to guide her into His plan. In the field where Ruth was, harvesting grain, she caught the attention of Boaz, the landowner. Boaz was impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her willingness to work hard. He decided to help Ruth, making sure she had enough to eat and was protected. But God didn't stop there. Boaz ended up becoming Ruth's redeemer, the one who restored her dignity and security by marrying her. The story of Ruth shows us that God honors those who remain faithful, even when all seems lost. Ruth's faithfulness transformed not only her and Naomi's lives, but also the history of God's people. Ruth became King David's great-grandmother and entered the lineage of Jesus Christ. When Ruth made the decision to be faithful, she didn't know what the future held. She just trusted in Naomi's God and chose to move forward. This teaches us that even in the most difficult situations, fidelity and perseverance open doors that we could never imagine. God honors those who choose to trust Him, even when the path seems uncertain. Have you ever felt like God was calling you to something great, but everything around you said it was impossible? Moses went through this. He was peaceful in the desert, tending his father-in-law's sheep, when God appeared to him in the burning bush. The call was clear, to free the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. But instead of rejoicing, Moses looked at his limitations. "Who am I to face Pharaoh?" he asked. And God responded with something extraordinary. "I will be with you." Exodus 3:12. Moses would not need to rely on his own abilities, but on God's provision. Moses was not eloquent, he felt incapable and was afraid. Still, God chose him. The Lord provided everything he would need to fulfill his purpose: words, signs, courage, and even Aaron to help him speak. Moses only had a staff in his hand, a simple and common object, but in God's hands that staff became a powerful instrument to perform miracles. This teaches us that when God calls us to something, He doesn't expect us to have all the resources ready. What matters is our willingness to obey and trust Him to provide. How many times have we felt like Moses? God gives us a mission, a purpose, but we look at our limitations. I don't have money, I don't have skills, I don't have time. However, what we see as a lack, God sees as an opportunity to show His power. He doesn't need much to accomplish great things. He just needs willing hearts. When we give God what we have, even if it seems little, He makes the impossible happen. Moses learned that it was not he who would free the people, but God through him. That's the key, trusting that God's provision always follows his purpose. When God calls us, he has already prepared everything we need, at the right time and in the right way. That doesn't mean it will be easy, but it means we won't be alone. Moses learned to walk by faith, even without knowing what lay ahead. And that is what God invites us to do. Trust in his calling and rest in the certainty that he will provide every resource, every answer, and every way out, not because we are capable, but because he is faithful. Have you ever stopped to think that everything God puts in your hands is a responsibility? When Jesus told the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, he wanted to teach us an important lesson. God gives us resources, gifts, and opportunities, and expects us to be good administrators. In the story, a man gave talents, a type of money, to his servants before traveling. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to a last one just 1. He distributed according to each person's ability, showing that God never gives us something we cannot handle. The first 2 servants took the talents and worked. They invested, made efforts, and multiplied what they received. When the master returned, they returned twice as much and heard, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things." Matthew 25:21. But the third servant did something different. He got scared, buried his talent, and did nothing with what he had received. When the gentleman returned, he returned exactly what he had received without any growth, and for this he was rebuked as a negligent servant. This parable challenges us to reflect on how we are using the blessings and resources that God gives us. Everything we receive, whether time, money, talents, or opportunities, is not just for our benefit. God entrusts these things to us so that we can multiply them and bless other people. Burying our gifts out of fear or laziness is wasting what the Lord has given us. The third servant did not lose his talent. He just didn't do anything with it. And that was your mistake. God expects us to be faithful in little so that he can trust us with even more. The truth is that God's provision comes with responsibility. When we use what he has given us wisely, we see fruit grow, not just in our lives, but in the lives of those around us. What do you have in your hands today? A talent, a small feature. Don't bury it. Invest, share, work. Be faithful in little, because God is a God who honors faithfulness. When you become a good steward of what he puts in your hands, you become part of his plan to bless the world. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to go through extreme difficulties without losing your peace? The Apostle Paul knew exactly what it was like to live in both abundance and scarcity. In his letters, he describes difficult situations, hunger, cold, persecution, and even prisons. Paul faced all of this, but he kept something precious in his heart, radical trust in God. In Philippians 4:12-13, he says, "I know how to be dejected, and I also know how to have abundance. In every way and in all things I am instructed, both to be full and to be hungry, both to have abundance and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ, who strengthens me." These words show something powerful. Paul did not depend on favorable circumstances for peace or hope. He had learned that his strength came from God, not the conditions around him. When he said he could do all things, he was not talking about living without difficulties, but about facing each challenge with the strength that comes from the Lord. We often think that our joy or security depends on what we have, but Paul teaches us that the most important provision is not what is outside, but what is inside. Within, the presence of God strengthening us. Imagine Paul trapped, chained in a dark and cold cell. Humanly, he had nothing, but he still wrote letters of encouragement, celebrating God's faithfulness. How is this possible? Because Paul knew that God's presence was enough. When everything seemed to be missing, he was sure that God was with him. This radical confidence does not arise overnight. It comes from real experiences where we choose to depend on God even in difficulties, believing that He will provide what is necessary. Perhaps you are facing a time of scarcity right now, little money, little enthusiasm, or few opportunities. But Paul's life shows us that even in these moments, we can trust that God is enough. The secret is to learn to depend on His strength and not ours. When you look at your own limitations, everything seems impossible. But when you look at God, you discover that you can face anything. He is the spring that never dries up, the resource that never fails, and the peace that remains regardless of the circumstances. Have you ever noticed how the fear of tomorrow can paralyze us? It's as if our mind builds bad scenarios before they even happen. The future seems like a great mystery, full of uncertainty, and we want to have control over it. But in truth, the future was never in our hands. He is in God's hands, and that is the best that could happen. In Jeremiah 29:11, God gives us an incredible promise. For I know the thoughts that I think of you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you the end you expect. This promise reminds us that God not only sees the future, but He has already prepared it. He knows every step of our journey and has plans of peace for our lives. The problem is that we often try to carry the weight of tomorrow alone. We worry about things we can't control. Will I be able to pay the bills? Will my family be okay? What if something goes wrong? The truth is that worry solves nothing. It just wears us down, steals our peace, and prevents us from living in the present. Think of the Israelites in the desert again. When God sent manna, He did not allow them to save it for the next day. Why? Because He wanted them to trust Him daily. This is the lesson we need to learn. Trust that God is already in tomorrow, preparing everything we need. Jesus taught us something similar in Matthew 6:34. Do not worry therefore about tomorrow, because tomorrow will take care of itself. When we surrender the future to God, we stop carrying a burden that we were not made to carry. Imagine a father holding his child's hand as they cross a busy street. The son doesn't need to look at cars or worry about the route, because he trusts that his Father knows where he is going. So are we with God. He holds our hand and leads us along the right path. The future may seem uncertain to us, but it is not to God. He is already there, taking care of every detail and preparing the best for those who trust in Him. When you surrender tomorrow to the Lord, fear loses strength and peace takes its place. Have you ever felt like you prayed for so long about something and it felt like God wasn't listening? Anna, a faithful and dedicated woman, knew this pain well. She dreamed of having a child, but the wait was long and painful. To make matters worse, she had to live with constant provocation from Peninnah, another wife of her husband, who had many children. Imagine Anna's heart, hurt by the wait, frustrated by God's apparent delay, and anguished by seeing time pass without a response. The Bible says that she cried and didn't eat, 1 Samuel 1:7. Anna reached her limit, but instead of giving up, Anna did what we should all do in times of waiting. She poured out her soul before the Lord. In 1 Samuel 1:10, we read that Hannah prayed with bitterness of soul, crying out to God with all the sincerity of her heart. She made a vow, promising that if the Lord granted her a son, she would dedicate him forever to God's work. That prayer was not just a request. It was an act of total surrender and trust. Anna understood that God had control, and she chose to trust, even without understanding the reason for the delay. God heard Hannah's cry, and at the right time, she received the answer. The birth of Samuel. The son she had been waiting for arrived, not because God had forgotten about her, but because He had a perfect plan. Samuel was not only a blessing in Hannah's life, but he became one of Israel's greatest prophets, someone who impacted an entire nation. Sometimes what we wait for so long has a much greater purpose than we can imagine. Waiting time is not a time of forgetting. It is a time of preparation. Anna teaches us that God answers prayers at the right time and in the right way. It's not easy to wait, especially when we see others around us receiving what we also desire. But Anna's story shows us that when we surrender our desires into God's hands and trust in His timing, the answer comes. Maybe you have been praying for something for a long time and already feel discouraged. Remember, Anna, God heard every word, every tear, and He is preparing the answer. God's silence does not mean His absence. Job was an upright, prosperous, and very blessed man. He had everything: family, possessions, health, and a peaceful life. But from one moment to the next, everything changed. Job lost his children, his wealth, and even his health. Imagine losing everything you love and value in a single instant. Job was left in ruins, sitting in dust and ashes, trying to understand what had happened. To make matters worse, his friends accused him, suggesting that he had sinned against God. Even his wife told him to curse God and give up. Job's pain was unbearable. However, something extraordinary happened in Job's heart. In the midst of pain, he did not abandon his faith. Job didn't understand the reason for all this, but he knew who God was. He declared with conviction, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end He will stand on the earth." Job 19:25. Even without answers, Job clung to the certainty that God was in control. His faith did not depend on circumstances, but on the character of God. Job chose to trust, even without understanding. At the end of the story, God restored everything that Job had lost, double. Not only did Job regain his riches, but he was also blessed with new children and a long, full life. But the greatest provision Job received was not material, it was spiritual. In the midst of pain, he came to know God in a deeper way. He said, "I had heard about you with my ears, but now my eyes see you." Job 42:5. The ordeal transformed Job, revealing a present, powerful, and faithful God, even in the most difficult situations. The story of Job teaches us that, in the midst of the greatest losses, God remains our greatest provision. Sometimes the struggles seem unbearable, and we wonder where God is. But just as He did with Job, He is there, shaping our hearts and leading us into a deeper relationship with Him. What seems like the end can in fact be the beginning of a new story. Job lost everything, but he gained more than he could have imagined. When we trust God, even in suffering, He surprises us with His faithfulness and provision. Have you ever looked at what you have on hand and thought, "That's not enough"? This is exactly how the widow of Zarephath felt. She was living in the midst of a devastating drought, without food or water, and was on the verge of despair. All she had was a handful of flour, some olive oil, and one last plan: to make a small meal for herself and her son, and then wait for death. But in that moment of total scarcity, God sent the prophet Elijah to her with an unexpected word. "First, make me a small cake and bring it here." 1 Kings 17:13. Imagine the scene. A woman who already has almost nothing is challenged to give what she has left. Elijah, however, was not asking out of selfishness. He brought a promise from God. The pot of flour will not run out, nor will the cruse of oil fail, until the day the Lord gives rain on the earth. 1 Kings 17:14. The widow could have doubted, refused, or held on to what little she had, but instead she chose to trust. She gave up what she had, believing that God would keep His word. The miracle happened. The flour and oil never ran out again. Day after day, she had enough for herself, her son, and Elijah. What seemed scarce was multiplied by God's faithfulness. This story teaches us something precious. When we put the little we have in the hands of the Lord, He transforms it into abundance. Sometimes our faith is tested in the midst of lack, when it seems like we have nothing left to offer. It is at this moment that God invites us to trust Him and give what we have. The widow of Zarephath challenges us to stop looking at the limitations of our resources and start looking at the God who multiplies. The flour and oil did not increase all at once. They were renewed daily. God does not give us everything at once, but He sustains us every day at the right time. When we trust in Him, little becomes enough, and the miracle happens. It doesn't matter the size of your need or the small amount you have today. In God's hands, the impossible becomes reality. Have you ever faced a storm so intense that you thought you couldn't survive it? Jesus' disciples lived this experience firsthand. Once, after a long day of teaching, Jesus told His disciples to cross the Sea of Galilee. While they were sailing, a huge storm formed. Violent waves shook the boat, and the wind roared around. Fear took over them. Imagine the disciples, experienced fishermen, desperate, screaming for help, believing they were going to die. But Jesus was there, sleeping peacefully in the back of the boat. It seems strange, doesn't it? While everyone was panicking, Jesus rested. The disciples woke Him up, saying, "Master, do you not care if we perish?" Mark 4:38. Then Jesus stood up, looked at the wind and the waves, and said, "Calm down, be silent." Mark 4:39. Suddenly everything went silent. The storm dissipated and the sea calmed down. Jesus then asked His disciples, "Why are you so shy? Do you still not have faith?" This story teaches us that even when the storms of life seem out of control, Jesus remains in the boat. Sometimes difficulties make us forget that God is with us. The strong wind and high waves scare us, and we begin to doubt. But the Lord never abandons us. He may seem silent for a while, but at the right time He rises and calms the storm. The presence of God does not exempt us from facing difficulties, but it guarantees us that we will never be alone in them. Storms test our faith, but they are also opportunities to experience God's power. If the disciples had not faced the storm, they would never have seen Jesus calm the sea. Maybe you're going through a difficult time right now where everything feels out of control. Remember, Jesus is in the boat with you. He has the power to calm the wind, the waves, and most importantly, your heart. Don't let fear speak louder than your faith. Trust that, even in the midst of the storm, God is in control and calm will come at the right time. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your sustenance would come from heaven. This is how the people of Israel lived during the 40 years in the desert. After leaving Egypt, they soon realized that there was no food on the way. The famine became a test, but God, in His faithfulness, sent the manna, a special bread that covered the ground every morning like a thin layer of frost. God gave a simple instruction. Each person should collect only what they needed for that day. No more, no less. It was a daily exercise of faith and dependence. However, some suspicious Israelites tried to save the manna for the next day. Human logic said, "What if there is no manna tomorrow? Better make sure." But something surprising happened. The manna that was accumulated outside of God's orders rotted, created worms, and smelled bad. This teaches us that God's provision is daily. He wants us to learn to trust Him one day at a time, without trying to control tomorrow with our own efforts. The people needed to trust that every morning God would fulfill His promise. This daily miracle was not just about physical sustenance. It was about teaching the people to depend on God. Sometimes we want to accumulate financial, emotional, or spiritual security. We try to ensure that nothing is missing in the future, but just like the manna in the desert, God teaches us to look at the now and trust His care day by day. Of course, we must plan for the future, but without allowing anxiety to take the place of trust. God's faithfulness is renewed with each dawn, and He always gives us enough to face the day. Think about it. The people of Israel didn't need to worry about the next day's manna. They just needed to trust that God was faithful to meet their needs every day. When we learn to live this way, we stop carrying the weight of anxiety about tomorrow. God gives us the strength, sustenance, and peace needed for today. Just as the manna fell faithfully, God's grace continues to fall upon our lives with each new dawn. Trust, the provision will come at the right time. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where everything you had seemed too small to solve the problem? A widow in a city in Israel experienced exactly this. Her husband had died, leaving huge debts. Creditors were about to take their children as slaves to pay what they owed. Desperate, she sought out the prophet Elisha and told him about her situation. Elisha asked, "What do you have at home?" 2 Kings 4:2. Her response was simple and sad. "Your servant has nothing in the house but a cruse of oil." The oil seemed insignificant given the severity of the problem, but Elisha gave unusual guidance. He asked the widow to find as many empty vessels as possible, even borrowing them from neighbors, and start pouring the oil. Imagine the scene, the woman and her children collecting vases throughout the neighborhood, probably without understanding how that would solve their problems. But in obedience, she began to pour the oil, and the miracle happened. The oil did not stop flowing until all the vessels were full. That small bottle, which seemed so insignificant, was multiplied by the power of God. The widow sold the oil, paid her debts, and was still able to live on what was left. This story teaches us that God can use what we have, no matter how small it may seem, to perform great miracles. Sometimes we look at the resources in our hands and think it's not enough. But God asks us, "What do you have?" He does not ask us for what we do not have. He just wants us to give what little we have in faith, and He does the rest. Olive oil represents God's supply that never runs out. Just as He multiplied the widow's oil, He can multiply the little we have in our lives, money, talents, time, or strength. When we put everything in the Lord's hands, He takes care of every detail. It doesn't matter the size of the need or the weight of the debt. God is able to transform an impossible situation into a testimony of His faithfulness. The question is, are you willing to give up the little you have and trust Him to make the impossible happen? Have you ever felt like you're in a dark valley where everything seems lost and has no way out? David describes this powerfully in Psalm 23:4. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." This verse shows that even in the darkest moments of life, when difficulties seem greater than we can bear, God is present. He does not leave us alone, nor does He abandon us along the way. The valley can be scary, but the presence of the Lord transforms fear into confidence. David knew what it was like to cross valleys. Before becoming king, he went through persecutions, escapes, and times of loneliness. He faced giants on the battlefield and giants in his heart. But through each challenge, David found comfort in the fact that God was with him. The Shadow Valley was not the final destination, but only part of the way. We often want to avoid the valleys at all costs, but it is in these places that we experience God's deepest provision, His peace, strength, and care. The image of the shepherd leading his sheep through the valley is comforting. The shepherd does not abandon his sheep. He is always by their side, protecting them and showing them the safe path. This is how God is with us. When we face moments of pain, grief, or uncertainty, He walks alongside us. The shadow of the valley may seem frightening, but it has no power over us. What really matters is that God is with us, lighting our path and leading us safely. If you are going through a valley right now, remember David. The valley is just a passage, not the end of the journey. God's presence is the greatest provision you can receive in these moments. Even when everything seems hopeless, trust that the Lord is with you. He not only walks beside you, but also prepares what comes after the valley, a place of rest, restoration, and victory. God is the good shepherd who never leaves his sheep, even in the deepest shadows. Imagine being in the middle of a hungry crowd, far from home, with nothing to eat. This is exactly what happened when Jesus was teaching. More than 5,000 people in a deserted place. The worried disciples suggested that Jesus dismiss the crowd so that everyone could leave and buy food. But Jesus answered something surprising. "You give them something to eat." Matthew 14:16. The disciples looked around and saw only a boy with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. How to feed so many people with so little? Human logic said that was impossible. 5 loaves and 2 fish were not enough even for the disciples themselves, much less for an entire crowd. But Jesus didn't care about the quantity. He asked them to bring what they had, blessed the bread and fish, and began to share. The miracle happened there before everyone's eyes. The food was multiplied, and everyone ate and were satisfied. Matthew 14:20. Furthermore, there were still 12 full baskets left. This miracle teaches us that God doesn't need much to accomplish great things. Sometimes we look at our resources and think, this is not enough. It's too little to make any difference. But in the hands of Jesus, little becomes much. He doesn't ask us to solve everything on our own. He just asks us to surrender what we have. Just as the boy gave his 5 loaves and 2 fish, God invites us to give the little we have with faith, and He does the rest. The multiplication of the loaves and fishes is a powerful reminder that God is the provider in all circumstances. Even when needs seem too great and resources scarce, He is able to multiply. The key is to trust and deliver. Maybe you're looking at your limitations right now, thinking you don't have enough. Remember, God does not see the quantity, but the disposition of your heart. Give what you have, no matter how small it may seem, and let God make the miracle happen. Have you ever worked hard on something and in the end didn't see any results? This is what happened to Peter and some of the disciples. They were experienced fishermen, and after a whole night of casting their nets into the sea, they returned empty-handed. Imagine the feeling of frustration and exhaustion, hours of effort with no fish to show for it. It was at that moment that Jesus appeared and said something surprising. "Cast your nets to fish." Luke 5:4. Pedro somewhat reluctantly replied, "Master, having worked all night, we caught nothing, but at your word, I will cast the net." Peter's response reveals something essential. He decided to trust Jesus even when everything seemed meaningless. He had already tried, failed, and was ready to give up. But in obedience he cast the nets again. What happened next was a miracle. So many fish were caught that the nets began to break, and the boats almost sank because they were so full. Pedro was impressed and realized that this was not just an ordinary fisherman. There was the power of God in action. This story teaches us something profound. God's provision does not depend on our effort or our abilities. Peter did everything right during the night, but it was only when he obeyed Jesus' word that he saw the miracle happen. How many times do we work, try hard, and still not get the results we expect? It is in these moments of failure that Jesus invites us to trust Him and try again, not based on our own strength, but on His word. The difference is in obeying with faith, even when it doesn't make sense. If you feel that you have been working unsuccessfully, that your nets are empty, remember this story. The same Jesus who filled Peter's nets can make the impossible happen in your life. Maybe you've tried for too long and are ready to give up, but when Jesus is on the boat, things change. Trust His word, obey, and cast the nets once again. The miracle may be just a step away, waiting only for your trust and faith in God's power. Have you ever felt invisible, like no one could help you or understand your pain? The blood flow woman knew this feeling well. During 12 years, she suffered from an illness that left her impure, rejected by society, and physically and emotionally exhausted. She spent everything she had on doctors, but none of them could cure her. His situation seemed hopeless. However, something inside her made her act when she heard about Jesus. She thought, if I just touch His clothes, I will be healed. Marcos 5:28. Imagine the scene. A tight crowd, everyone trying to get closer to Jesus. That woman, weak and tired, mingled among the people, determined to reach the Master. She didn't need words, attention, or a huge miracle in everyone's eyes. All she wanted was to touch Jesus, even if it was just the hem of His garment. When she finally succeeded, a power came out of Jesus, and instantly she was healed. What seemed impossible became reality because of your faith. Jesus stopped and asked, "Who touched me?" The disciples found the question strange as the crowd pressed him from all sides. But Jesus knew that that touch was different. It was a touch of faith. When the woman came forward, trembling with fear, Jesus looked at her and said, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed of this evil." Mark 5:34. This encounter shows that faith, even when silent and discreet, attracts God's provision. He sees the hearts of those who trust him, even when no one else does. This story challenges us to seek Jesus with the same determination and faith that that woman had. Sometimes we are so tired, exhausted, and disappointed that we lose hope. But true faith leads us to act, to draw closer to God, believing that he has the power to transform any situation. If you are facing something that seems unsolvable, remember this woman. Don't give up. Touch Jesus with faith, and you will see that his power is able to heal, restore, and provide in any circumstance. Imagine being so in debt that the only solution seems to be to lose everything you have. This is how a widow felt when she looked for the prophet Elisha. Creditors were about to take her children as slaves to pay off the debts left by her husband. Desperate, she begged for help, and Elisha asked, "What do you have at home?" 2 Kings 4:2. Her response was discouraging. "Your servant has nothing in the house but a cruse of oil." For her, that was too insignificant. Elisha then gave a simple but challenging instruction. She should find as many empty vessels as possible from her neighbors, close the door of the house, and start pouring the oil into the vessels. Now, stop and think. What would happen if the widow doubted or refused to act? The miracle would not have happened, but she obeyed. He gathered vessels, called his sons, and began to pour the oil. Something incredible happened. The oil didn't stop flowing until all the vessels were full. This miracle reveals a powerful principle. When our faith meets action, God does the impossible. The widow didn't have much, but she used what she had and took the necessary step. Many times we wait for a miracle without being willing to act as God guides us. The oil only stopped multiplying when the vessels ran out, showing that the measure of God's provision is linked to our willingness to trust and obey. What can God multiply in your life today? Maybe you have something small that, in his hands, can become a lot. This widow's story challenges us to see beyond the limitations of what we have. She could have given in to despair, but she chose to trust and act. Maybe your situation seems impossible, like hers did, but just as the oil was enough to pay the debt and support your family, God's provision will also be enough for your need. The secret is to give the little you have, act with faith and trust that God will do his part. He specializes in transforming the small into abundance. Imagine walking through an arid desert where there is not a drop of water. The people of Israel faced this situation during their journey through the desert. They were tired, thirsty, and began to complain to Moses. "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Exodus 17:3. Despair took over them, and the lack of water seemed to be the end. But God, in his faithfulness, already had a solution that no one expected. He would draw water from a rock. God instructed Moses to take his staff and strike a rock in Horeb. It may seem strange. How could water come out of a dry rock in the middle of the desert? But Moses trusted in the word of the Lord, and in obeying, abundant water began to gush from the rock. Exodus 17:6. The people who minutes before were complaining and doubting were able to quench their thirst and see once again God's power and provision. The rock that seemed hard and lifeless became the source that brought relief and sustenance in the midst of scarcity. This miracle teaches us that God can bring provision from the most unlikely places. When we feel surrounded by difficulties with depleted resources, it is easy to doubt and question. But God is able to make water sprout, even from a rock. Many times we look around us and only see impossibilities, but the Lord sees solutions where we do not. It is not limited to circumstances. On the contrary, he uses moments of difficulty to show us his power and teach us to depend on him. If today you are in a desert of life where everything seems dry and hopeless, remember this story. The same rock that seemed to be a symbol of hardness became a source of life. In the same way, God can transform your driest situation into a place of abundant provision. The secret is to trust him and his word, even when everything seems impossible. Moses obeyed and saw the miracle happen. Perhaps what you need is to take a step of faith and believe that, at the right time, God will bring water to quench your thirst. Imagine being taken as a prisoner to a foreign land, where everything is different: the culture, the language, and even the food. This is what happened to Daniel and his friends when they were taken to Babylon. There, they faced a challenge. The king offered food that went against their principles and faith. In a place where everything seemed hostile, Daniel decided to trust God. He told those in charge that he did not want to eat the king's food and asked that he be allowed to follow a simple diet of vegetables and water, something that seemed insufficient to human eyes. Daniel's decision required courage and faith. Who could guarantee that he and his friends would stay strong and healthy with so little? But Daniel knew that the provision came from God, not from the king's table. After 10 days, something surprising happened. They were healthier and stronger than the other young people who ate the royal delicacies. Daniel 1:15. This result wasn't just physical. It was a testimony to God's power and care in the midst of adversity. Daniel and his friends were honored because they placed their trust in God above anything else. This story challenges us to remain steadfast in our faith, even when circumstances pressure us to compromise. Sometimes it seems easier to accept what the world offers, even if it goes against our values. But Daniel teaches us that God honors those who choose to obey him. When we choose to trust the Lord, he sustains us in ways that surprise everyone. What seemed like little to Daniel and his friends, vegetables and water, became enough because God's hand was upon them. If you are facing adversity and everything around you seems contrary to your faith, remember Daniel. God's provision does not depend on circumstances or what the world offers. He is able to care for you, strengthen you, and use your faithfulness as a testimony of his power. When we choose to trust God, even in difficult situations, he sustains and honors us. Adversity is not the end, but an opportunity to experience the Lord's faithful provision. Have you ever felt stuck in a weight that seemed endless? Joseph, son of Jacob, experienced this firsthand. He had great dreams from God for his life, but instead of seeing these dreams come true, he was sold into slavery by his own brothers and later unjustly imprisoned in Egypt. Years passed, and it seemed that God had forgotten about him. But even in prison, Jose did not lose hope or abandon his faith. He knew that even in the silence and delay, God continued to take care of every detail. Joseph's story shows us that the time of waiting is in fact a time of preparation. While Joseph was in prison, God was molding his character, teaching him to be faithful in little things and to depend on him. In Genesis 39:21, we read something powerful. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended his kindness to him and gave him favor in the eyes of the jailer. Jose did not stand still. He served with excellence where he was. What seemed like a delay was actually God working behind the scenes. At the right time, God caused Joseph to be taken before Pharaoh to interpret his dreams. In a single day, he was released from prison to become the governor of Egypt, the second most powerful person in the country. Joseph not only saw God's dreams come true, but he also became an instrument of provision for his family and an entire nation in times of famine. The waiting time was painful but necessary. God had never forgotten him. He was just preparing something much bigger than Jose could imagine. If you are waiting for something today, remember the story of Joseph. God's timing is perfect, even when it seems slow in our eyes. The Lord's care does not fail even for an instant. He is preparing you for something greater, shaping your heart and strengthening your faith. Delay does not mean that God has forgotten about you. He is behind the scenes working on every detail, and when the time is right, you will see that His provision is much greater than you could ever imagine. Have you ever stopped to think that gratitude is a powerful key that connects us to God's provision? In Luke 17:11-19, Jesus healed 10 lepers who cried out for mercy. They were told to go and present themselves to the priests, and as they walked, they realized that they had been healed. Imagine their joy. The leprosy, which had isolated them from the world, disappeared. However, only one came back to say thank you. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and glorified God, recognizing the great provision he had received. Jesus, surprised, asked, "Was it not 10 who were healed? Where are the other 9? Luke 17:17. The other lepers were so excited about their healing that they forgot to come back to thank the giver. That one man, however, received something even greater than physical healing. Jesus told him, "Get up and go. Your faith has saved you." His gratitude not only expressed recognition, but also opened the way to a deeper transformation. Salvation. This story challenges us to reflect. Are we recognizing and grateful for God's provision in our lives? Many times we receive blessings every day and forget to be grateful. The air we breathe, the food on the table, the daily protection, all of this is proof of the Lord's care. When we cultivate a grateful heart, we begin to see God's faithfulness even in the smallest things. Gratitude reminds us that He is the provider and connects us even more with His presence. Gratitude transforms our perspective. Instead of focusing on what we lack, we start to recognize what we already have. The man who came back to thank Him understood this. God not only met his need, but also touched his soul. May we learn from him. Whenever God provides something in our lives, big or small, we must stop, recognize, and be grateful. Gratitude opens doors, strengthens our faith, and makes us see that regardless of the circumstances, God is in control, and His blessings are countless. What we learn today is something that can transform our lives. God always has control of all things, even when everything seems lost. Just as He provided for Elijah in the desert, for the widow who only had oil, for the people of Israel in the valley, or even for the crowd with 5 loaves and 2 fish, He also takes care of you. Faith teaches us to look beyond the impossible and to see God's provision in small and large situations. Remember, you're never alone, and the Lord's promises never fail. Trust, give the little you have, and see how He transforms your entire story. If this video touched your heart, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel, share in the comments what you learned most today, or how God has already shown His provision in your life. Your experience can inspire others. Oh, and don't forget to like and share this video with those you love, so that more people learn to trust in the perfect care of our God. Until the next video,